Thank you so much for taking the time. Let me kind of give you a little bit of sponsoring thought around this particular event, where this came from, why we're doing this, and how we hope this adds value in your lives. So we did a client survey earlier this year, and this was one of those topics that was just at the front of everyone's mind. I being a father of 4 children, which every time I say that, I just feel just a sense of gratitude and sometimes a sense of overwhelming feeling of thinking about funding 4 college educations at some point in time. That's why I have my kids doing wind sprints in the yard and throw balls at them and going for that athletic scholarship. And I married a woman taller than me. We're hoping. No, it's an overwhelming thought to think about the cost of college, trying to balance that with preparing for retirement, taking care of daily needs. And for some folks in our generation, I'm experiencing this now, the same, which experience of aging parents. And how do you navigate these things? And so one of the things that I've learned in 20 years is that there's certain financial tools that have a lot of stigma around them. There's uncertainty, there's questions, there's common misconceptions, if you will. And one of my favorite sayings, it's not what you don't know that will hurt you, it's what you just don't, it's what you think you know that just isn't so. And so today's conversation is going to really be around that element of what are the facts and what are the misconceptions around specifically 529s primarily. How do they fit within other instruments and financial instruments, and used today as a really foundational educational experience. So thank you again for joining us. Without any hesitation, we'll get into things. So let's talk about why college is so important. What I think is really interesting is that there's actually a correlation between our education and long-term well-being and health. Some of that is attributed to the fact that more individuals who have college educations tend to have better access to health insurance and healthcare overall. And so they tend to address those health experiences through preventative versus reactive medicine that we get to have access to through quality health insurance. That's a big one when we think about our kids and their well-being long-term. They have more job opportunities. This is something I've seen and really watched over the last 20 years evolve. We've seen industries that historically didn't require a college education, airline pilots being one of them. It was completely normal and acceptable for an airline pilot to have specialized training in that particular field. And over recent years, the requirement has moved from specialized pilot training to college education and then on to that advanced airline flight training schools. And so we're seeing not only more opportunities, but more of an expectation in industries that an individual has some level of college education before they'd even be considered as a candidate. And so college is a huge door opener for our kids. One of the things I tell my daughter, she tells me, I don't like math. And I said, at 10 years old, don't shut doors. Just don't shut doors. You don't know what you're going to want to do in life. Leave as many doors of opportunity open for you as possible. Just operate from that mindset. And one of the things that college is for many individuals is a large door opener to opportunities we may not know we want. They make more money. I don't think this one's a big surprise, right? So when we look at lifetime earnings, when we look at annual earnings, we're talking 72% on average in annual income. You're talking lifetime earnings in excess of millions of dollars. It's a big deal when we look at income in around college. And that grows whether it's an undergraduate, a master's, or doctoral degree. Those lifetime earnings and annual incomes go up. So education, not always, but the majority education is a door opener for opportunity and higher income. The last one is meaningful. So when we look at our last 2 largest recessions we've experienced, when we look at 2008 and 09, the housing crisis, and then we look at the COVID-related recession we experienced, the majority of that unemployment happened in lower educated individuals with high school degrees or less. So when we saw unemployment, nationally move up a lot, most of that was in individuals who are less educated versus others. The high school only educated folks or under had unemployment rates in excess of 17 and 20%, depending on what period we're talking about. So they bear the brunt of the first wave of economic downturn. They're the first to leave and often. So those 4 core things. So I know, college is meaningfully expensive. Sometimes we can wonder if it's worth it. But those core 4 things, I think, is why us as parents put college as a forefront objective for our children. So who cares about funding college? Well, a big piece of it is middle class folks, individuals who know that they're going to bear the brunt of it. When we look at FAFSA, we look at how these calculations are done. Individuals with massive resources, college isn't much of a concern. They know they have the financial resources to cover it. And as a result, it will just be an expense that they navigate through seamlessly. Individuals in lower socioeconomical situations know that they won't have the ability to put money towards it, or they know that there'll be scholarships, grants, and other resources, but they are focused on the more day-to-day piece. And so what we find is 66% of families are concerned they're going to have enough money for college, and 82% of parents say it's extremely or very necessary for the child to receive aid. So what that says to us is, hey, we're really concerned about it. I'm not sure I can pay for all of it. How are we going to tackle this problem, right? So I thought a fun way to do this when we're thinking about presentations, it's college. We got to have a test. So from this point forward, this is kind of a, you can participate at your will on this. But I'm going to present this as a pop quiz. So for those who are getting sweaty palms like I did when they threw pop quizzes at me, my apologies. I can't see your paper. So score yourself. If you want to give yourself 100% no matter what, you probably don't have everyone's paper you could cheat on, but no one's going to evaluate your paper at the end of this. But let's have a little fun together if we can and really learn together. So are you ready? All right. A 529 savings plan can only be used to save for an in-state school. So if you live in Indiana and you do the college choice 529, which is Indiana's plan, if your child goes to the University of Alabama, where my daughter wants to go, can I use Cora's 529 plan to cover any bit of college that I'll have to pay for if she doesn't get a scholarship for pitching for the University of Alabama? Is that true or false? Can I use her Indiana plan for Alabama? All right. It's false. It's false. I rated that question a little differently there towards the end when I talked about my daughter, but you can use, I can use the Indiana plan for her in Alabama. So a funny side note, my 2-year-old already can say roll tide. It's a silly thing in my home. So let's talk about this. A 529 plan can be used in any state. So we could take advantage of our in-state specific benefits for the plan. Colorado, for example, has a income tax deduction that we use if you use the Colorado plan. Indiana gets a tax credit. We can evaluate if those things, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So, but we could take advantage of our state-specific plan if appropriate, and not worry too much of where a kid goes to college. So, and it can cover college tuition and fees, room and board, books, computers and other supplies, required equipment, additional expenses of any special needs beneficiary. So if you have a child with cerebral palsy, for example, a couple friends of mine experienced cerebral palsy, and they're college graduates. They had to have adapted services when in college. This could have been used for those purposes. And for those of you who send your children to private school, if you get funded ahead and you have extra resources in your 529, it turns out it can be used for K through 12 tuition expenses up to $10,000. So there may be some reasons not to do that, but if one found themselves in a situation, it's available. Watch out for non-qualified expenses. So insurance, sports, or club fees. So this can't pay for, Jimmy's fraternity fees, fraternity dues, or things like that. Transportation cost, repayment of student loans, an aggregate of 10 grand. So that's a new change that can be done through, or non-K through 12 tuition related expenses. So really it's broad. The 529, in my opinion, is pretty broad in what it could cover. That's I think one of the gifts of the 529 plan is that I think when we think of college, we think of all these expenses, and there's certainly some ones that this doesn't touch on, but the majority of them would be covered or available to be covered via a 529 plan. So you're better off sticking with your local plan. Quiz question number 2. Are you better off sticking with your local state plan? False. All right. The first thing we want to do is, and kind of true, right? First thing we want to do is we want to evaluate that state plan, right? So Indiana has then they just upped it for Indiana folks. It used to be 20% of the first $5,000 is an Indiana state tax credit. Now it's up to the first 7,500 that can earn a 20% Indiana state tax credit. Other states have different rules. Colorado, for example, has an income tax deduction. If you put $10,000 into the Colorado 529 plan, then you can take $10,000 off your taxable income, and then you make that deposit in the state of Colorado. Colorado only has a 4.5% income tax, 4.4, 4.5, somewhere in that range. Not a big win, and so you'd want to evaluate that plan. Tax incentives are just one factor, and so we want to understand what are the investment choices. If the investment returns inside that plan are mediocre, below par, then the tax incentives may not be enough to counterweight those poor performances of a particular state's plan. And so it's false, but it's also true, as in it depends on the state we're in, the significance of those tax benefits, and the investment returns we get within it. So that's one that takes some additional consideration. A little of a trick question from there. So 529s can't be used for adults. So let's say you want to go back to college, right? Or you have additional dreams or visions for your education, but you're 50 or 40 or 30. Can you open a 529 for your future college vision and plans? False. So when Lauren and I were first married, we were undecided. Neither one of us were certain whether we wanted to have kids or not. I know they always say that's one of the things couples should know is, do you want to have kids or not? Well, there's this alternative, which is neither one of you are super sure. 4 years later, I think 4 kids later and 17 years later, I think we've answered that question well for us as a couple. But one of the conversations we had is we might. And that might was enough for us to know that college education planning was something we should start on early. So we started saving for college before our first kid was born. And one of the questions my wife asked me is, well, what if we don't have kids? And what if that child doesn't go to college? And I said, well, I've always dreamed about going to culinary school someday, my love. Maybe I'll go to culinary school before I go to retirement, into retirement. I don't think that's going to be a challenge using our 529 plan before kids. I don't think we're going to have any issues using that a lot. We also dialogued that we may be able to give that to or transfer to my niece and nephew. My brother had children at the time, and so we'd had that discussion as well. So, and that would count. And so the reality is that the 529 plan, sometimes we don't know where life's taking us. We don't know how many kids we're going to have, what scholarships are going to be available. We don't know where the future holds. And so there's flexibility there as well. And for individuals who are thinking about pursuing master's or more advanced degrees as their career is advanced, a 529 can be a great tool to be able to use some tax benefits as a way to plan for that master's or further education that may be coming down the pike for you to advance your career. 529 plans are just for traditional 4-year colleges. This is one of my favorite ones. All right, you got your answers down? Here we go. Answer's false. Many junior community colleges, vocational and training apprenticeships qualify as postgraduate programs. So I grew up in Troy, Ohio, and the Hobart Welding School, which is the #1, sometimes ranked #2, but it's #1 welding school in the nation, is in my hometown. It's incredible, right? I think one of the things we've recognized in recent years is that a 4-year college education isn't the right fit for everyone. More than ever, there's opportunities in the trades, and demand for individuals in those spaces have never been higher. But quite often, there's additional education outside of our basic high school degree that's required for us to excel in those areas. A 529 can be an excellent tool to pay for things like welding school at the Hobart Welding Institute in Troy, Ohio. I don't own, I have no investment in it. No, that's not a plug. Just proud of my hometown. Or the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park, New York, one of the finest culinary schools in the nation. We can use these 529 plans to open doors of opportunity for our kids during the past that they dream of with more flexibility than I think most people realize. All right. 529s are difficult to open and maintain. That's a great question. Do you have your answers down? False. So again, the presentation is going to plug help with somebody like me, but many of our clients set these up on their own, and depends on someone's situation, the state they live in, and their comfortability in doing something like this. Many individuals open 529 plans directly with the state programs and state plans without the use of a financial advisor, and that's certainly an acceptable thing to do, and we guide some of our relationships to do it. Opening the plan, setting it up, maintaining it. Most plans have what's called age-based investments with them. So based upon the age of the beneficiary, the investment will naturally get more conservative as the child gets closer and closer towards their college years, much like a age-based retirement investment strategy inside of 401k or employer-sponsored plan might. And so most investors who have been saving for retirement have some familiarity with these kind of concepts. And so when they open a 529 plan and see something that's age-based, they have that little light bulb and say, I remember things like this. I've seen one of those in my 401k plan. And so 529s are designed often to be meaningfully user-friendly, and the complexities are not that advanced. Certainly, I, as an advisor, somebody who supports our clients in figuring those things out. However, to call them complex, overwhelming would be a stretch, in my opinion. Okay. So for my high income earners out there, right? I think this is one of those ones that we get after a lot. There's so many things that phase out. I made too much money. I've grown. What about a 529? If I made $300, $400, $500,000 last year, can I put money into 529? I know my Roth IRA, I can't anymore. I know, fill in the blank. What about the 529? Is that true or false? If I am a high income earner, can I still put money into 529? Got to pay attention to how that was worded, right? So it said can't. Those test questions always tricked me as a youngster. Yeah, there are no income limits in 529 contributions, which I think is meaningfully helpful. When we look at the reality of FAFSA, income-based financial support, it's our high income earners that are going to have to face the larger share of college contributions. And so I think this is a very wise thought around this particular financial tool, is not to have an income-based threshold. So if you're a high income earner, you don't need to worry about you going over a particular piece. In fact, one of the unique things we'll talk about is 529s are a very unique tool when it comes to estate planning. Okay. So we're going to talk about that next. So one of the things we'll hear a lot is, well, I maxed out my 529. Somebody said this to me within the last few days. Like, what's the max? I put the max in, and they're referencing the state, where the state steps aside and says that's all the tax benefits you're going to get from our particular state. Each state's unique. Indiana's 7,500, for example. And so when they were using that language, it's really referenced. But there's a unique wrinkle in the estate tax planning rules in and around 529s. And we actually use this to one of our clients' advantages shortly before he passed a handful of years ago. Wonderful man. Is that we can advance our gifting limits. So there's an annual gift tax exclusion under current code and current year of 17,000. So what that means is that we could contribute a large amount of money into a 529 on behalf of grandchildren. So we can accelerate 170,000 in gifting into 529s. So that seems a little crazy. You're thinking, okay, I'm watching this for my kid, not my grandkid. But maybe this is a video you save and just play the section at Thanksgiving for the grandparents. Hey, there's a neat estate planning tool called a 529. Let me talk to you a little bit about it. So we can maximize the current 12,920,000 lifetime gift exemption. So where this plays, and I'm not going to get too granular here, is where this plays is that if we have grandma and grandpa who have high amounts of resources and they have grandchildren and they know they're sitting at an estate tax threshold, they can accelerate gifting into a 529, get 5 years of gifting, advanced for those grandkids, and make a big difference, and use a 529 as kind of a, as a quasi trust strategy from that perspective. So let me kind of play how this works is that we have Susan and Howard grandparents, because let's make it generic, right? And have Adam and Melanie as the parents and Jennifer and Tim as parents. We have grandma and grandpa here, and then they have 2 kids, and one of those children have 3, one of those children have 2 children, right? So they're able to then make $170,000 per grandchild each. So $240 each in total for each one of those grandkids. So in this particular situation, this grandparent removed $850,000 from their estate in one foul swoop. $850,000 is gone and out of their estate. The parents removed $510,000, and so you look at this and say each child is starting with $340,000 in gifts. So it's a massive, massive tool when we look at this. Now, when we do this accelerating gifting, then we have to understand, okay, this has effects for years to come and how much can be put in. Okay. I'm not going to get real granular on this one because I know who's watching this, and this probably doesn't apply to everyone on this. But know that if you do this advanced gifting here, and we fast forwarded 5 years, then we have some timing implications that we need to navigate through. So do you have a funded trust that provides educational support to your beneficiary? All right, so here's a question that I think is critical in terms of a unique application to 529 plans. So some folks choose to set up an irrevocable trust, a grantor irrevocable trust, for the benefit of a child or a grandchild. The challenge with trusts is that unless those investments are managed very carefully, the tax brackets in a trust are meaningfully compressed, which means that you don't have to create a lot of income inside of a trust. That if you exceed $14,451 in earned income inside of a trust, the tax rate on that income above that is 37%, which is meaningfully higher than for individuals. The advantage of using a 529 specifically inside an irrevocable trust is that income would be excluded in that from that calculation. So there's some 529 401 level planning. So if any of you get really quizzed later on, that one's pretty intense. So I already covered that, forgive me. So here's why this works is that when we make this 5 years of gifting, all of that money is outside of our taxable estate. So the real advantage is that I can shove this money into a 529. It's considered a completed gift, but there's still some control over this. And so it's immediately removed from the donor's estate, except the donor still has some control over those funds because they can change the beneficiary if they need to. So pretty powerful tool when it comes to that piece. So replay that at Thanksgiving. That's just for whatever you got out of it, just replay that for Thanksgiving for your grandparent, for your parents. Your kids will thank you later. You lose your savings. Next text question. You lose your savings if your children don't go to college. What if your kid doesn't go to college? Right? What if they end high school and they venture out to start their own business, or maybe you got a kid who's a great athlete. They're going to go on to the majors. They're going to try to make it to the show, if you will. What happens to the money? Is it gone? It's gone. It's a great question. Is that true or false? It's false. So we got a lot of different choices if we find ourselves in this situation. First thing is we can transfer the assets, yourself to any family member of the beneficiary. So, so if I've got, my 4 kids, they've got a 529. Cora, doesn't go to college for whatever reason, or Charles or whoever, whichever my kids, but they end up having a family of their own. I can just kind of let that money sit when that child goes on to college, when that child has children and maybe they go to college, it could be used to fund grandchildren. Let's say my first kid doesn't go to college, but my second child does. Then I can use those residual 529 resources to pay for the next college education expenses for a next child. There's generally no tax penalty on the withdrawal from principals. So for example, I put $10,000 into 529. When I go to take the money out, that $10,000 generally is going to come out without penalty in most states. Distributions are taken pro rata. Okay, so what that means, that's a funky little word, pro rata. Like, we're not Latin here, so let me give some clarity there. What that means is gains come out with basis. So you can't just hit the basis that you put 10,000 in, you've made 10,000, so you've got 20,000 in that account. For every $1 you take out, $2 you take out, one's going to be basis, one's going to be gain, because you're at a 50-50 gain to basis ratio in there. So my daughter was just learning, my oldest was just learning ratios last week. I'll have to play that for her to show her that, yes, honey, you do use ratios even as a grown up. There is some use in that math. So taxed at ordinary income. So it's the money you've made. So take that 10 grand that you've made, that's going to generally be treated as ordinary income plus a 10% penalty on it. So the value there is to understand that, yeah, you're going to get hit with taxes, but it's taxes on money that, to me was earmarked towards another goal that for whatever reason we didn't need. We've probably gotten some tax benefits along the way. All right. Maybe a tax benefit from our state or what have you. We're going to get penalized. It's not a great situation, but it's certainly not giving up the money. Anyone can contribute to a 529 plan. That one's true. Parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles. Like when my nephew turned 2, he had all the toys in the world that he could need, and his birthday shortly after Christmas. And so I said, hey, it's to my brother, I'm going to just write a check to his 529 plan. I know that's kind of boring. I don't think you need another gift. Is that okay? So uncles can do this. Cousins, neighbors. And if you're like my wife and I with 4 kids, we even ask strangers to put money into their 529 plan. Just kidding. So anybody can put money into a 529 plan, and anybody can do it on behalf of your child as well. So that's nice. If you guys know any rich strangers that want to help with college education, Charles said he'd love that. Savings in a 529 plan can dramatically reduce financial aid eligibility. This is one of my favorite questions and what we're going to talk through. So if I put money in the 529 plan, it's going to dramatically decrease financial aid eligibility. Is that true or false? That one's false. So assets are considered the account holders. Therefore, they may have much less of impact on financial aid. So expected student contribution, expected family contribution. So when we look at assets, income, students' income, they're expected to put half of their income towards college and 20% of their assets. But a 529 is considered parents' assets. So only 5.64% of parents' assets count towards. So yes, it has an impact, but considering it's considered the account holder's asset, it has much less of an impact than, say, putting a savings account in your kid's name, which we see a lot of folks do. I just hung up with the phone with somebody that's been their process. So simply taking money from a savings account into a 529 plan increases financial aid eligibility. So they're a very great tool from that perspective. So let's talk about some of the other college savings vehicles, if we can. So a Coverdell ESA are used mainly for school while a child is young, since the $2,000 per year limit makes it hard to accumulate sufficient funds for college. So there's when we look and say, okay, that's an optional tool. It can be, but we see the Coverdale mainly used for private tuition education because that $2,000 limit. If just some math for you all, to set those with soon to have children or young kids, if we take a average cost of college today, so room, books, fees, and tuition around $23,000 to $26,000 for in-state. Here in Indiana, that would cover in IU, Purdue, Ball State are all in that range. And so are most state schools, you know, if you're paying as a resident of the state. So the cost of college on average is going up about 6% per year and has been for some time. That varies, and private and public institutions have different rates of increasing cost. If we just assumed an 8% rate of return on our money and we start saving when the child is born, it takes about $630 a month each and every month till that child turns 18 to fully fund room, books, fees, tuition for an in-state school for a little tyke. So when we look at that Coverdale ESA, that $2,000 limit just isn't going to get it done. We'll talk about life insurance and annuities and IRAs and where these fit. So let's look at life insurance. So tax-free withdrawals for college. So here's the big piece with that. So when we look at a 529 plan, if we pull the money out of a 529 plan and we use it for one of these qualified expenses, we don't pay tax on the distribution. That's a big win. So if we've started early and we've really grown this investment by a meaningful amount, when your child goes off to college, if you use it for one of those qualified expenses we named earlier in this presentation, there's no taxation on that growth. That is a meaningful win. For life insurance, depends how the money comes out of it, there may be taxation on that distribution. Loans available. You can't borrow against the 529 plan. So if you got 10 grand, that's all you got. Life insurance, there's loans available depending upon the cash value. There's some complexity. There's a footnote at the bottom of this one for that reason. That's something you're considering. That would be a place to definitely talk to me or your advisor. Draw loans count as income for FAFSA. No, if qualified, maybe. So this is one of those not straightforward answers. So may require additional premiums. No. And then for life insurance, it is a yes. So the challenge with utilizing life insurance and planning using cash value life insurance for college planning is when you start taking those distributions, it may automatically trigger needing to put more money into the life insurance policy. That's a challenging planning strategy. There's no 5-year accelerating gifting in life insurance, but we can get those big dollars we talked about into 529s. So, and are there penalties for over contribution? And why am I going over the life insurance like this? Because this is a tool that's suggested a lot by insurance agents to utilize. But these are things that are often not mentioned in that advice. And so we want to be careful because we can lose tax benefits inside of a life insurance policy if we put too much into one. All right. What about an annuity? Would an annuity be a good alternative, right? So we talked about the tax-free withdrawals. An annuity fails that through every filter. You've got to be 59 and a half before we can take money out of an annuity without tax penalties. So unless you're a dad like me who had kids later in life when you're older, most individuals are not going to be 59 and a half without tax penalties. And there's income tax due on the gains in an annuity contract upon withdrawal as well. You can't borrow against an annuity, nor can you borrow against a 529. Is it considered an asset for FAFSA? The 529 is, but the annuity isn't for a reason. For the majority of the people, you're not going to be old enough to take the money out. And in addition to that, the income tax implications of doing so could be meaningfully detrimental at younger ages and older ages. So we don't have premiums in 529s. We don't have the 5-year giftings inside of the annuity. So we could see pretty quickly that an annuity, even if someone suggested it's not a really good strategy for planning for college specifically. Now, this is one if someone's older. And I think this slide doesn't necessarily get into that, but tax-free withdrawals for college sometimes, right? So for my Charles, I'll be over 59 and a half when he's in college. I joke sometimes I'm going to use my Social Security income to pay for his school. But one could use a Roth IRA in that situation. We can't borrow against it either way. Is it considered an asset for FAFSA? No. So someone in my situation could pile more money into a Roth, and if they're ahead for retirement, and use that as a tool. May require additional premiums. No. 5-year accelerated gifting, like the 529 for the Roth, that's not available, and penalty for overcontribution, right? So there is in the Roth, so there's income limitations in Roth IRAs. Certainly that could be available. Roth money can be available through a 401k without those income limitations. So a Roth is a kind of a maybe tool if you're old enough, usually not what it's used for. Okay, enough of that. Let's hop on to the next test question. What if your kid gets a scholarship? What if you're raising Mr. or Mrs. Smarty Pants, right? Or what if your daughter gets a basketball scholarship, or she gets a soccer or lacrosse or softball scholarship? What if she's a heck of an athlete and a university wants her to lead their sports team? What's the problem? Do we have any problems there? All right. So that was a trick one. Trick question number 2. That's mostly false. So savings can be transferred to another family member. We talked about this already. There's generally no tax on the principal's withdrawal, and then you can withdraw amounts equal to the scholarship without penalty. Tax may still apply. So that 10% penalty piece we talked about. So let's say that they get a full ride tuition, right, to fill in the blank, right? And that cost was $30,000. We could take a $30,000 distribution equal to that scholarship without the 10% penalty, but probably pay an income tax on that distribution. Not the worst thing in the world. So how likely is a full scholarship for a child? All right, so let's talk about this, right? Because I hear this a lot, all right? Most universities, other than a handful of sports, do not offer full scholarship, right? Scholarships. They just don't. You take something like a baseball team or a softball team. There's too many players and they don't have enough scholarships. So at best, your child's probably getting a partial scholarship from a sports perspective. Academic scholarships are meaningfully difficult to come by on a full ride basis. And so even if you do get a scholarship scenario, it's not common for a child to get a full ride. And then what about all the expenses that are not covered? So we talked about books and some of those other costs. Those are expenses. So that could be used from a 529 plan. So for example, my alma mater got in big trouble because they were using scholarship money for book expenses, and the scholarships monies weren't designed to pay for books for particular athletes, but they figured some workaround, and Ball State got in trouble for this. So someone can get a full ride scholarship, but there are expenses that can be excluded from scholarship money that a student still required. Often we see a child go on and want to advance their degree, especially if you're not strapped with student loan debt in those first 4 years. And so it can be used for furthering their education beyond their undergraduate. So, and then we could change beneficiaries. And I think this one is meaningfully not taken into consideration, right? So if you have more than one child, what's the likelihood of all of your children getting full ride scholarships, right? I do have one client their 3 daughters did that. Each 3 of these women are brilliant academically and athletically. But I've done this for 20 years. I've only heard of one couple pulling that off. I've asked if I can bottle some of the water that they had in their home, raising these, brilliant young women. So it's not common, is my point. How'd we do? So Ray, I hopefully we had a lot of good marks. Hopefully you all are destined to get a scholarship in 529 education. So congratulations. Let's talk about this. So This presentation was put together by John Hancock, which offers a 529 through the Alaska program. This is not designed as a promotion of their product by any stretch of the imagination, but there is some great resources on their website. So I'm gonna put that up for you there, right, for a minute. So let's talk about this for a minute. All right. I know one of the things that I wonder often, right? My wife and I were just kidding about it. Of my 4 kids, I think my William is most likely to follow in my footsteps. The kid loves math, and he hasn't met a stranger since he was born. He loves presenting in front of his church. He often raises his hands and says, I want to do that. It's part of the school they go to. And so there's aspects of my personality he holds on to very similarly, right? We talk a lot about what our kids' futures might look like, their strengths, the things they're still figuring out, what they're working through, right? And it's exciting to think about. When we think about planning, we think about our role as parents. Education is one of those pressing and emotional things. And the gift of doing this for 20 years is one of the things I found is that our story, our own personal story in this space, often affects how we think about it. The couples come from different perspectives because their parents had different financial capability, different planning tendencies, and made different choices along the way. And so sometimes couples avoid this conversation, right? Because it can create discourse or conflict. That's one of the roles that I play, is how do we think about and how do we consider and how do we come to some sort of resolution as a couple about what we want to do for our family. If you're a grandparent, this is one of the greatest tools we can utilize to make a lasting, significant, yet specific legacy for those that we love and the grandchildren will leave behind someday. So the big piece that I wanted to have this conversation for all of you is don't wait. Unlike retirement, we graduate from college, we graduate from university at 21, 22, 23 years old, right? And we've got 40 years to figure out retirement, if not a little longer, depending upon how long you decide to stay at it. In college, for college, they found statistically that on average, kids are going to go do that in 18 years, right? That was a government-sponsored study. And so one of the things when we think about college planning is that we have half the time to get ready for college as we do for retirement. So the implications of the delay are even more substantial than they are for retirement. So if you walk away with knowing nothing else, the biggest thing I'll leave you all with today is that don't wait. Have a conversation with your child's parents, with your spouse. Consider what you want to do and how you want to support education for that child in the future, and get started now. I'm going to pause for questions. I don't see any in the chat. Let me pause for a moment before we end this. Okay. Well, again, thank you so much for investing your time with me today. It is always a pleasure to be able to connect with each and every one of you. It is truly an honor to serve you as your advisor. I hope that the education you experienced that you gained today from this presentation is something that will serve you and your family. If you have any questions for me as a result of watching this presentation today, please don't hesitate to reach out and get your questions answered. That ends today's presentation. I look forward to seeing each and every one of you soon. Be well.